things got surprisingly worryingly worse, as we first warned about the terrible effects of the coronavirus outbreak at the end of January. Our COVID-19 reports, published for past 3 months, revealed unobtrusive economic prospects in the future, but proved to be very optimistic even within a week. A month later, on March the 2nd, we updated our global growth forecasts and noted that the COVID-19 virus is a loot of the world because it destroys economic activity globally in modern, prosperous societies. We regret to announce that the economic picture has deteriorated since then. While some are hard to believe because of the rally on American stock exchanges, we are going to an economic crisis in Bible rates. Just as we warned in early April, we are only in the early stages of the global economic crisis sparked by the coronavirus pandemic. Now we have to consider the possibility of other waves of COVID-19 infection. This is something that, among others, prominent experts from China have warned. It is unpleasant to analyze how badly any second or third wave of pandemics will affect the global economy. We summarize our recent economic scenarios in this podcast. The bad scenario, the effects of the emerging financial crisis, which have been largely marginalized in all economic projections of the coronavirus pandemic. When one looks at the current terrible economic figures, he cannot escape the fact that banks will suffer great losses. This is particularly difficult for European banks, since they have been in terrible troubles since 2008. Their situation has worsened since the ECB's misdirected policies. A stress test released in October of the ECB showed that half of the largest banks on the euro side could not survive if the financial counterparties and some commercial customers withdraw their money. Of course, this is what is happening in a recession that's stopped right now. The economic effects of the epidemic and lockdowns will challenge companies across the world. The world economy contains a large concentration called zombie companies. The term is used to describe a firm that cannot afford debt revenues from the current revenue stream. Zombie companies survive as they provide cheap credit limits to prevent weak banks from failing. Now, when global demand collapses due to the impact of coronavirus and lockdowns, these companies cannot continue operations. They and many non-zombie companies will fail due to revenue streams from increasing consumer demand and production. In December 2019, we named this stage of the global economic crisis as flood. When these weak banks appear, they will begin to fail by dragging Europe and then the rest of the world into the financial crisis. We are very close to this point right now. Therefore, in the bad scenario, we assume that the European banking crisis occurs at the latest in summer or autumn. As we have mentioned many times, the global systematically important banks, GSIBs, will be globalized all at once due to the high concentration in Europe. This will again collapse global asset markets and lead the world economy to depression. We also assume that only a mild second wave and treatments have improved, and the economic effect is limited for the disease caused by COVID-19. The good scenario. In the good scenario, we control the outbreak until the end of June. We're making a breakthrough in virus treatment, and we have an effective vaccine in winter. The virus gradually decreases and becomes a seasonal flu-like thing. Governments publish large incentive packages to support sick economies. Central banks resort to direct financing of government deficits and helicopter dropping for ordinary citizens. European governments provide blanket guarantees for bank obligations, and deposit bails are issued to support the European banking sector. Although the world economy survives the bullet, it emerged as a centrally controlled socialist zombie affected by periods of recurring regional and national hyperinflation. The apocalyptic scenario. While looking for the worst possible outcome for the current outbreak, there is only one option: the 1918 to 1919 outbreak known as the Spanish flu. Therefore, we predict the economic consequences of the apocalypse scenario based on the historical progress of the Spanish flu, following the latest modeling of SIDRAP. In the doomsday scenario, we assume that the destructive corporate bankruptcy flood began in May. This leads to bank summers and a banking crisis starting from Europe in the summer. Unfortunately, there is no real improvement in the global economy. And then the second wave of the COVID-19 outbreak. The virus is beginning to spread worldwide in the fall of 2020 and continues in winter. And a possible third wave bursts in spring of 2021. Countries around the world are forced to restore large and brutal lockdowns. Supply chains are completely disintegrated, and global logistics routes are disrupted by a large number of patients or frightened employees, and the tight closure of both factories and national borders. Countries started to protect vulnerable industries and resources. Food security becomes the main national security issue. Global food transfers are stopped or disrupted. These horrible factors, combined with rising unemployment, business failures, and market turmoil, are knocking down the global banking industry. Bank losses are so great that, although deposit bails are enacted, they are insufficient to prevent banks from failing. The European banking sector is completely collapsing. Then the global financial order is booming. Global trade is evaporating. The world succeeded in its economic destruction. The hit. It is quite explanatory that the emerging medium-term economic outcomes of the above-mentioned economic outcome scenarios ranged from the mere recession to the complete collapse of the global economic order. With any reliable margin, it is completely impossible to predict how the course of the virus has developed in the coming months. But we need to be prepared for the most terrible scenarios. The major blow to the global economy by COVID-19 is already evident in the leading indicators of the OECD. The IMF also warned of the negative economic effects of a possible second wave. However, we state that they do not fully explain a possible global banking crisis, and that the second wave of the pandemic may be more dangerous than the first. The path forward. Governments must be prepared for both the global supply chains and the collapse of economic cooperation and order. Countries must be prepared to survive on their own, at least in the fall and winter of 2020. This means addressing the issue of food safety immediately and ensuring that each country has sufficient domestic food production or reserves. Investors should be prepared for the extreme events in the financial markets and the unrecognized, even crazy monetary responses of central bankers. We are facing a big unknown. In the worst case, we could see the repetition of the apocalypse events that have not been seen in 100 years. However, even if we get rid of this result, the economic crisis is likely to be severe. Regardless, we must survive and see better times on the other side. Crises always offer the opportunity to change and improve economies and societies. How successful we are and how fast we heal will be determined by our response to the epidemic and social and economic difficulties that arose afterwards. Most of the idea, comment, information, and criticism containing in these videos have been created by Daily News Report. Before making any important investment decision, use the information contained in these videos as a starting point for conducting your own research. If you make any investment or legal decision, it is wise to consult an expert before making this decision.